Hello, I'm Paul White, partner in the Agricultural Business Consultancy division of Brown&Co. We're here in North Lincolnshire today for our third farm walk video to discuss changes in agricultural policy and how funding's to be redirected. We're specifically concentrating on grant funding and the planning implications associated. I'm joined today by, to my right, Rob Meadley, divisional partner at our Brig office, and to my left, Steve Catney, planning consultant from our Lincoln office. Rob, if I could turn to you first.
Thanks, Paul. So as many people have heard, there's going to be some new grant funding, part of the Farm Investment Fund, and there's going to be a couple of elements of that. So the Farm Transition Fund, and then a smaller sub-element of that. And also we're going to be looking out for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and that will probably focus more on diversification opportunities on farm, so for people to look at different enterprises. We'll be able to see later a collaborative grain store project that we got funding for in 2018, 2019.
Thanks, Rob. Shall we take a walk? So, Rob, with area-based subsidies reducing, is now the time for farmers to start looking at alternative enterprises and income streams?
Yes, it is, Paul. At the moment, it's an excellent time to review alternative activities, different enterprises and diversifications on farm, and looking at the opportunities that may be available. So it's really important to assess the farm assets and see what you've got. And what different activities you could possibly run there. But it's quite important to understand your skills and what works for you, looking at different opportunities. So if you don't want to work with the public, it's probably best not to have a farm shop or a pumpkin patch. Do that assessment, look at a business opportunity, create a business plan, and even look to test it on friends and family from the outset to see if the opportunity would work.
Thanks, Rob. And Steve, so from a planning perspective, should rural businesses be looking at either obtaining sort of capital lump sums or income streams? What are the options?
Well, it very much depends what the farm needs. You've got options using traditional farm buildings, modern farm buildings, land and so on to get diversification projects where you can get a revenue stream or indeed enjoy a capital receipt. So it depends what the farm actually needs, but from the point of view of planning, there's everything available from new residential development for agricultural tenancy use, right through to, on the edge of settlements, fairly large residential development and everything in between, really.
Okay, Steve, so should landowners look to take advantage of these opportunities on their own or go into a joint venture?
Yeah, that's a good question. Lots of developers out there willing to get involved with joint ventures, but the more the developers do and the less the landowner does, the lower the profit the landowner actually sees. So if they're interested in getting involved themselves and doing more, they can get a larger percentage of the uplift for residential development and the sort of thing that they're trying to achieve. The other thing that's worth considering is that most local authorities are very supportive of business opportunities. So they can use existing buildings or even new buildings for a variety of business uses on farm, which also can be quite lucrative, both for revenue income and also they could sell them on for capital receipts.
Okay, and what about the energy opportunities?
Yeah, well, there are quite a few energy opportunities still around. Large-scale PV, photovoltaics, anaerobic digestion. There may also be opportunities in the near future for on-farm wind. And then, of course, the government's new grant scheme for biogas injection into the grid is also worth considering. There's some real opportunities there.
Thanks, Steve. So, Steve, any new activity requires change of use, so does it always require full planning?
No, not at all, Paul. Obviously, full planning and outline planning are required for some of the detailed applications like residential use for large schemes and so on, but there's quite a lot that can be done under permitted development. Most landowners will be familiar with the sort of permitted development on agricultural use for up to 1,000 square metres for new buildings, extensions or 10 to 20% and so on. And that's a fairly light touch process of prior notification to see if the application needs any support at all with the local authority. Some issues like environmental issues, flood risk and so on may mean that the local authority asks for further information on application, but often not at all. Then there are other specific permitted development rights like the Class Q, which is an interesting one, that allows you to develop not just traditional but modern farm buildings into residential development. So that's quite useful, and that's again a fairly light touch as long as the local authority doesn't find anything too difficult for you to deal with, but it's a good one. And then of course the business side of things, so the Class R opportunities, which as we said before can be very varied from shops to business use, offices, schools, all sorts of things can be gathered under Class R. The thing with Class R though is that once you've got your permitted development, it is known then as a sui generis use, and that's a very specific use for whatever you've decided to change it to. And then any other further change has to be with a planning application, planning permission. And then finally, out of all the options for the lighter touch planning, there's a fairly recent one, came in 2018, called Planning in Principle. And that's a light touch approach for developments of up to 9 dwellings. So there's quite a lot of opportunity to not have to go into the detailed planning applications of either full or outline.
Yeah, interesting. So how long does it normally take to get planning permission?
Oh, they're all different. Obviously, you've got the time for consideration and determination by the local authority. So that's 28 days for a prior notification, 56 days for one of the Class Q type jobs. The interesting thing is, if they don't respond within the time period, it's considered to be a deemed consent, so you've actually got the permission. So if they wanted to come back after that time to ask for more information, they couldn't do so. The big issue though is not so much how long it takes to determine the applications, but how long it takes to prepare them. So even for a full application, which is a minor development, so relatively small development of 8 weeks, it could take 3 to 6 months to pull together the information for that sort of application. So you have to have a look at what's required to be submitted, when that's required. An example of a difficulty there could be if you need bat surveys. You can only survey a certain part of the year, and if you catch it just wrong, you might have to wait 6 months before you can do the survey, before you can prepare the application, before it can be submitted. So how long is a piece of string in terms of how long it takes? Anything from 28 days through to a year.
Interesting. Thanks, Steve.
That's okay.
And if we were thinking about a grant funding application, Steve, that needed planning, we really need to be getting on with that pretty soon then.
Absolutely right. A lot of the grant funding requires either a planning permission or at least a submission plan permission, doesn't it? So obviously think far ahead of what's required to support that application rather than just a grant application itself. Absolutely right. Okay,
thanks Steve. So Rob, if a landowner is looking to fund the project himself, how soon should he start talking to his bank manager?
As early on as possible, Paul, really. It's very important to engage early. But it also depends on the type of project. So it might be the case of we want to test things early on and maybe start small and for the enterprise or diversification to grow organically, which might just be a little bit of capex on welfare facilities or various things to cover health and safety requirements. So we might be able to do that out of existing funds, cash flow or overdraft. But certainly for larger scale projects, big investment required, we want to be engaging the bank manager early and also consider a very detailed business plan. So looking at the capex, cash flow implications of that. So we've got that. And then the business plan would also then become useful if the project was potentially eligible for grant funding. We could then take that business plan forward and use it as part of the grant application.
Thanks, Rob. It's getting cold. Shall we walk this way? So, Rob, if we have a farmer who has a project that might attract grant funding, what are the key elements?
For a successful project, Paul, in our experience, we really need to be thinking about the project early on. So going back to developing a business plan. We certainly should be taking advice from the outset. We'll need to act quickly in terms of the grant deadline dates, so as soon as we know those, we need to be thinking about if the project needs planning consent. We probably need to be engaging the likes of Steve fairly early on to get the necessary consents. One of the biggest elements that we need to pay attention to is getting quotes. So if it's a building project or a piece of equipment, then we need to get the quotes, and it's important to get on with that pretty early on. For any good grant application, we need to have quantifiable, measurable outputs. So whether it's reductions of greenhouse gases we can calculate, or increased output per hectare, per tonne, per whatever it is, we need to understand those and have that as part of the assessment that we're going to be doing. So that rolled into a business plan is always very useful in terms of the writing of the application and coming up with the outputs. So can we create a job from the project? That's a really big tick in the box. But also bearing in mind market research as well. So one of the things we have to consider is stuff like competition analysis. So we don't want to displace other businesses of similar types. So it's having all that rolled into one package and doing that from, well, as early as we can, taking into account the professional help and advice we need.
So typically, what sort of lead time should you be looking at?
If we've got an idea in our minds now, and considering we might need planning permission, Steve, what time frames we need to be on it pretty quick, don't we?
We do. Two issues really with the planning. First of all is the timescale to pull the planning application together, and if that needs specialists, we've already talked about bats, and that can be, the ecology can be a seasonal issue, and if you miss the window, that will hold you up. But also secondly, the planning process and the legislation is changing all the time, so we really need to review what the legislation is, look at the best planning approach, the best type of application that's required, and give that advice early on. So really you want to be looking at these sort of projects a year before you want to be delivering them, just to be sure you can get that all in place.
Within Brown&Co, in the not too distant past, we've had over 300 successful applications, so we've seen all different types of projects, so we have a good idea of what might work and what will be eligible and what should be or could be successful.
Absolutely.
Good. Thank you to both Rob and thank you to Steve for joining me today. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. If you'd like any further information, please contact your local Brown&Co office. Thank you.